me start with a question. Does everybody understand Spanish in the audience? No? Okay. There's some people who are English only. Well, this is, we're here welcoming Eduardo Lalo to, again, to Malvern Books. We had a previous reading a year ago where Eduardo actually presented his book, Simon. And in this occasion, we're presenting two books to the two projects. One is a completed and published book, the translation of his novel, La Inutilidad, translated as Uselessness, published by the University of Chicago Press, translated by the one and only Suzanne Gil Levine, a legendary translator of Latin American literature. And we'll be doing some readings from the translation and from the original with Eduardo. And we're also presenting as well a work in progress. If I can have we're presenting the work, the ongoing translation or the translation process of Intemperie, which we had also presented last year, and it was published in Spanish, but now we are going to have the opportunity of listening to some of the some passages, some sections from Intemperie, as they've been translated into English by Sean Manning from the Spanish and Portuguese department. He has a PhD from UT, where he's also working translation. Let me say some quick words about Eduardo. We have a very prestigious guest tonight in terms of his accomplishments as a writer. Not just as a writer, he's also an essayist, photographer, and a visual artist. His books are very special because they actually redefine the very concept of book, of what a book is. He combines text with photography, he combines text with drawings. In fact, you can actually see his work as a visual artist over at the Latin American Benson Collection, where we're going to have an opening of a show of his photographs tomorrow at 4 o'clock, so you're invited to see that. You'll see that that aspect has to do with, let's say, what's beyond the text is also something that appears in the books that we'll be looking at. He's the author of a number of books, La Isla Siguiente from 2002, Los Pies de San Juan from 2002, as well Donde, which is a very interesting experimental book combining both photographic images and text from 2005, Los Países Invisibles from 2008, El Deseo del Lápiz, another interesting sort of hybrid sort of project in which he combines photography from carceral sort of institutions in Puerto Rico, from a particular prison, and it's combined with a reflection about coloniality and incarceration in Puerto Rico. Necropolis, which is a book of poetry that's actually combines with drawings, and the books that we're going to be presenting today. Now, and of course, Simon, his novel, which in 2013 won the Rómulo Gallegos International Novel Prize, the most prestigious award for novel in Latin America, sort of like the Pulitzer Prize. He returns to Austin. Last year, he was a visiting professor offering a class on Caribbean poetics, a graduate seminar. So in a way, he is old acquaintance. He's actually coming home to Austin now, and home to Malvern Books, given that this is the second event with him. Now, let me talk a little bit about the rules of the game, because this is going to be sort of an experimental type of presentation. Because what we've agreed is that we will be presenting both selections from Uselessness and from Intemperie, but Eduardo is not making the selection. He's asked us to make the selections and to surprise him, so that we can we're going to be hearing the English version first, right? And then Eduardo is going to, after he sort of realizes what we've chosen, right? He's going to be reading the Spanish version, his original version, afterwards. And at the end, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss, essentially, what the selections mean for him. We will have an opportunity of being able to engage in a discussion of what uselessness is about as an album. Talk about Susan Gil's accomplishment, Susan Gil Levine's accomplishment in her translation. And then we'll also have an opportunity to hear from Sean in terms of where he's taking the translation of Intemperie, right? And being able to actually have a discussion on that as well. So after we read selections, first in English and then in Spanish, of the works, we're going to engage in a conversation. Both Sean and myself will raise some initial questions, but then we'll open it up to the public to talk about these two books. So we're essentially, it's a presentation of two books, Uselessness and The Elements, which is the tentative title of the translation of Intemperie. So it's up to, I'm choosing first. So we are starting with a selection from Uselessness. That's from page 154 from Susan Gil Levine's translation. And I'm giving an opportunity to Eduardo to find it as a first page here. And this is the Uselessness is a Bildungsroman, and it's a sort of autobiographical, pseudo-autobiographical, semi-autobiographical story about a Puerto Rican student who goes to Paris to do his graduate studies. And it's basically growing up or a sentimental education. And part of it actually involves a series of, let's say, turbulent relationships with women. One named Marie and the other one named Simone. And I'm choosing a passage that has to do with the nature of these relationships. And it starts this way. After a night of interrupted sleep, we got off at Austerlitz station and parted on the metro platforms. Simone was going to visit her father, to get clean clothes, to ask if she could find work again at the hotel, and the next day she would go back to my place. I went to my studio on the Impasse de l'Astrolabe. Paris looked like an old postcard, a familiar panorama that I observed with strange indifference. As I entered my building, I opened the mailbox. It was filled with junk mail, but there was also a fistful of letters. I examined the envelopes stamped in San Juan or New York. The one for my parents containing a much-needed check. And I counted 3 letters of different thickness with my address in Marie's tiny handwriting. I organized them to read them in the order they had been sent. The first went on for 5 pages in lines that scrolled downward. Knowing her, I knew that they had been written in bed. She recounted, grosso modo, the heartbreaking tale of her disappearance. Her mother had hired a lawyer to have her declared incapacitated and thus to place her under the guardianship of the family. An ambulance had taken her to the airport, and on that same day, it was nighttime in New York City, she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. There she discovered the consequences of her act. Her ward companions terrified her. She was in a world of madmen, and she realized she had crossed a line. This, more than anything else, forced her to react. She didn't want to be one of those incurable crazies who have conversations with themselves and repeat absurd gestures. That first night, she became determined to get out of there as soon as possible. She managed to get Dr. Simons to discharge her and to administer the rest of her treatment at her parents' home. The last 2 pages were about us. They included a complicated reflection on what Marie called our time, without clarifying whether she meant past, present, or future. She asked me to write to her, to forgive her, not to forget her. I folded the pages and put them back into the envelope, thinking of them as a message in a bottle that had drifted to shore from a shipwreck in a distant ocean. I realized how much Simon and Spain had made me forget. I didn't want to brood over the sordid aspects of the letter and preferred to ignore what it implied about me. The second letter had been written 20 days later. It was very short and barely covered one side of a small sheet. It began by reminding me that she had written to me and had not received an answer. She presumed cynically that the absence of news implied that I was having a blast. She couldn't believe that our entire past deserved nothing more than this disregard. The letter stopped at the end of this paragraph without any further salutation. Below, without anything further, was her signature. A familiar unhappiness took hold of me. Once again, I witnessed the zigzag of her emotions without being able to interrupt or to respond. The city, which so recently had been stripped of its old associations, once again rolled over me with the patina of all that I had endured. Her depressive complaints, more than the pain of loss and nostalgia, brought Marie back into my life. The third envelope contained something thick. I felt it, putting off opening it for a moment. In it, there was only a cassette. I went over to the radio and put it in the player, but before pressing the play button, I paused. The idea that I was going to hear Marie's voice again made me stop dead. I resisted for a minute, knowing that I would give in. I realized I was, in some way, betraying Simon, but I sat down at the desk with a cigarette and coffee. Marie spoke as she had so many times before, from the hollowed place that had room for only the two of us. In her monologue, I heard pauses and transitions that seemed to contain my responses, the phantom of our dialogue. Nothing remained of the edginess of her second letter or the clinical case history of the first. As I listened, I became aware of the powerful bond between us, which despite everything endured. Marie signed off, but I stayed at the desk until the tape stopped automatically. I felt a joy words could not describe, a joy unlike the passion inspired by Simon. My feelings for Marie touch other places in my past and my being, like a palimpsest of our lives, something I couldn't destroy without destroying myself. Even while knowing it would upset me, I wrote to Marie that very evening. I spoke of what her voice had awakened in me. To explain my silence, I told her I had just spent a few weeks in Spain. I didn't mention Simon or go into any details. Thus, I committed a vile act towards both of them, but at the same moment, I could not do nothing else.
Well, I'm very happy to be back here at Malvern Books. So, let's see how this experiment goes. Pages. For sure. Después de una noche de sueño entrecortado, bajamos en la estación de Austerlitz y nos separamos en los andenes del metro. Simón iba a visitar a su padre, a buscar ropa limpia, a preguntar si podía ser nuevamente empleada en el hotel y al día siguiente volvería conmigo. Fui hasta mi estudio en el Impasse de la Solade. París parecía una postal vieja. Era un panorama familiar que observaba con extraña indiferencia. Al entrar a mi edificio abrí el buzón. Estaba repleto de hojas de publicidad y había además un puñado de cartas. Examiné los sobres matasellados en San Juan o Nueva York, el de mis padres que contenía un cheque imprescindible, y conté 3 cartas de distintos grosores en los que mis señas habían sido escritas con la letra diminuta de Marie. Las organicé para leerlas en el orden en que habían sido enviadas. La primera tenía 5 páginas, con renglones que iban torciendo hacia abajo. Conociéndola, sabía que la había escrito en la cama. Hacía, a grandes rasgos, la historia patética de su desaparición. La madre había contratado a un abogado para que fuera declarada incapacitada y así pasar bajo la tutela de la familia. Una ambulancia la había llevado al aeropuerto y ese mismo día, en la noche neoyorquina, fue ingresada en un hospital psiquiátrico. Allí descubrió las consecuencias de su acto. Sus compañeros de pabellón le inspiraban pavor. Estaba en el mundo de los locos y se dio cuenta de que había cruzado una frontera. Esto, más que otra cosa, la hizo reaccionar. No quería ser parte de los incansables monologantes, de los reiteradores de gestos absurdos. Desde esa primera noche se propuso salir de allí lo antes posible. Logró que un tal Dr. Simmons la diera de alta y organizara la continuación del tratamiento desde la casa de sus padres. Las 2 últimas páginas eran sobre nosotros. En ellas había una complicada reflexión sobre lo que llamaba nuestro tiempo, sin que estuviera claro si era pasado, presente o futuro. Me pedía que le escribiera, que la perdonara, que no la olvidara. Doblé los folios y los volví a guardar en el sobre, pensando que eran una botella de náufrago llegada de un océano lejano. Me di cuenta de cuánto Simón y España me habían hecho olvidar. No quería, sin embargo, detenerme en los aspectos escabrosos de la misiva y preferí ignorar lo que me implicaba. La segunda carta había sido escrita 20 días más tarde. Era muy breve, apenas cubría la cara de un papel pequeño. Tenía el tono gélido de los regaños. Comenzaba recordando que me había escrito y que no había recibido respuesta. Suponía cínicamente que la ausencia de noticias implicaba que todo me iba a las mil maravillas. No podía creer que nuestro pasado no mereciera más que las muestras de este olvido. La carta terminaba al finalizar un párrafo. Estaba desprovista de despedida. Abajo, sin más, estaba su firma. Sentí un desagrado familiar. Una vez más asistía al zigzagueo de sus emociones, sin intervención ni oportunidad de terciar de nada. La ciudad que solo un momento antes había estado desprovista de asociaciones, volvía a cubrirme con la pátina de mi historia en ella. La queja depresiva, más que el dolor de lo perdido y su añoranza, hacían que Marie volviera a mi vida. El tercer sobre contenía algo grueso. Lo palpé, retardando el momento de abrirlo. En él solamente había un cassette. Fui al aparato de radio y lo puse, pero antes de apretar el botón que haría correr la cinta, me detuvo la idea de que iba a oír la voz de Marie. Me debatí unos segundos, sabiendo que era una batalla perdida. Pensé que cometía una pequeña traición a Simón, pero me senté frente al escritorio con un cigarrillo y un café. Marie hablaba, como lo había hecho tantas veces, desde el espacio inmemorial en el que aparentemente solo cabíamos los dos. En su monólogo había pausas y transiciones que parecían contener mis respuestas, el fantasma de nuestro diálogo. Nada quedaba ahora de la falta de tolerancia de la segunda carta o del historial clínico de la primera. Me percaté, según escuchaba, del vínculo poderoso que nos había unido y que permanecía vivo pese a todo. Marie se despidió, pero quedé junto al escritorio hasta que la cinta paró automáticamente. Descubrí que lo que no encontraba palabras dentro de mí era alegría. Una alegría distinta a la que me producía Simón. La de Marie tocaba otros lugares, iba y venía de otros sitios. Era un objeto viejo, una huella que había sido testigo de tantas cosas, algo que no podía destruir sin destruirme. Sabiendo que era un acto trastornador, le escribí a María esa tarde. Hablé de lo que había despertado su voz. Le conté, para explicar mi silencio, que había pasado unas semanas en España. No mencionaba a Simón, no aportaba ningún detalle. Cometía un acto vil hacia las dos, pero en ese momento no podía hacer otra cosa.
It's a moment that's the first visit that the protagonist makes to a couple's house that he met by chance. He started getting interested in indigenous studies, and he discovered this writer, Pierre Plomb, and he happens to be reading it in a restaurant and all alone, and at a neighboring table this couple notices the cover and recognizes it, and it ends up that they knew this person, and so that starts up this friendship, mentorship, and this is when he first visits their apartment. At the appointed hour, I went up to the third floor. The smiling corpulence of Didier Pétremont appeared in the doorway. On all the shelves in the apartment, there were books and papers, as well as large clay pottery, without the glossy finish of enamel or the usual polish of Chinese or Japanese porcelain, which, judging by the rustic look and tarnished coloring, must have belonged to more ancient cultures. We went to sit around their work desks. Behind Pétremont was a canvas painted in dark ochres and reds with scenes from the life of the Buddha. Sometime later, I would learn that the unframed silk wall hanging was a Tibetan tanka created in Dharmasala by artists in the Dalai Lama circle. On the table were piles of thick books, some of those lying opened containing illustrations of works of art and texts written in the Oriental alphabets. I was expecting to enter a world like the one the character of Neptune encounters when he follows Clock, but here I do not see any object from the Amazon or anything remotely American. Pétremont must have noticed my surprise because he took the initiative to explain. As you can see, Pierre and I took different paths. He went towards America, and I towards Asia. I studied at the School of Eastern Languages and specialized in the Far East, especially the Khmer and Vietnamese cultures, even though I originally studied Chinese and Sanskrit. I see. Don't feel cheated. The Tupi-Guarani peoples resemble the ethnicities of the Golden Triangle more than one might assume, and I followed Pierre's research for something more than friendship. Later, Son will show you the photographs we promised you, but let me offer you coffee, and do tell me who you are and why you're here in Paris. In over a year, no French person had asked me this question. Such courtesy was considered unnecessary because the city was one of the centers of the world, and my wanting to be there, like any foreigner, was taken for granted. We were attracted to French culture, and its natives did little to inquire about our circumstances. I began giving Pétremont some basic information. I spoke of my studies, of my desire to write, of the interests that led me to become enthusiastic about Plomb. But the warmth of his listening encouraged me to enter into personal details. I spoke of my hard times, of Marie's suicide attempt, of the loneliness I had experienced in the city, and how reading Neptune and the world Plomb had opened to me had made it possible, in so many ways, for me to keep going. Pétremont listened to me, smoking one of the pipes he had lined up on his desk, sipping the coffee that Son, his wife, had brought with a smile and a slight bow, before sitting down to participate in the conversation, and also to light up her long pipe. When I had finished, Pétremont responded, "I see that at your age you have lived a lot and suffered quite a bit. It must not have been easy for you to remain in the city, which in so many ways is not welcoming. It's true that here there are, as everywhere, good people, but I must add that they are also well hidden." "I met a Puerto Rican in Saigon," said Son. "He was with the Americans fighting." "He was forced to," I said. "I know. That's why war is tragic." "I don't know if you know," said Pétremont, "that Pierre did not get to teach in the university until shortly before he died. For the academy, the cultures of the Amazon were almost totally lacking in interest. They didn't have the prestige of the great pre-Columbian civilizations. Many still share the viewpoint of the conquistadors, except that now they're looking for the gold of the dead. The Indians who interested Pierre were nomads. They didn't build anything lasting and walked around naked. Lévi-Strauss opened a theoretical path, but Pierre's writings were groundbreaking. That is, his complex and human portrait of those beings on the verge of extermination. Our spiritual poverty, I mean the typical Westerners, even among the well-educated, is a bottomless pit. After striking a match and lighting his pipe again, he added, "To a certain extent, I was prey to those prejudices. I began studying Chinese and Sanskrit, the Buddhist and Taoist cultures, and all this was worthwhile. It has greatly enriched me. However, one day I obtained a position at the Alliance Française, and they sent me to Phnom Penh in Kampuchea. Over the years, I traveled in Laos, Thailand, Burma, and Vietnam. Aside from the national languages, I learned the languages of the mountain villages, and after leaving the Alliance, I spent long periods of time with some of them. I didn't have the confidence to make myself the voice of Pierre's memory and carrying out his legacy. Besides, many of those peoples are still living, though they grow more and more bitter and alienated by modernity. Anyway, in France and in other parts of Europe, we have the obsessive passion for archaeology. If a culture works in stone or metals, we can dig up its knickknacks and put them in a museum. What hasn't been noted is that those institutions are gigantic mausoleums. There's nothing living there. The story of Neptune you refer to as divine, but tragically, it describes an impossible wish.
A la hora de la cita, subí al tercer piso. La corpulencia sonriente de Didier Pétremont apareció en la puerta. En todas las estancias del apartamento había libros y papeles, además de grandes vasijas de barro que no tenían la claridad de esmaltes y el pulido de las chinas y japonesas, y que por su rusticidad y la coloración de sus óxidos deberían pertenecer a culturas más antiguas. Fuimos a sentarnos a su mesa de trabajo. A espaldas de Pétremont había una tela pintada en ocres y rojos profundos, con escenas de la vida del Buda. Tiempo después sabría que la seda que colgaba sin bastidores era una tanka tibetana creada en Dharamsala por artistas del círculo del Dalai Lama. En la mesa había pilas de gruesos libros. Algunos de los que estaban abiertos contenían ilustraciones de obras de arte y textos escritos con alfabetos orientales. Esperaba entrar a un mundo semejante al que el personaje de Neptune conoce al seguir a Clock, pero aquí por ninguna parte veía un objeto amazónico ni remotamente americano. Pétremont debió de percibir mi asombro porque tomó la iniciativa al explicar. Como puede ver, Pierre y yo tomamos caminos diferentes. Él fue hacia América, yo hacia Asia. Estudié en la Escuela de Lenguas Orientales y me especialicé en el Extremo Oriente, sobre todo en las culturas Khmer y vietnamita, aunque estudié originalmente chino y sánscrito. Ya lo veo. No se sienta defraudado. Los tupi guaraníes se parecen más de lo que se pudiera suponer a las etnias del Triángulo de Oro. Y seguí las investigaciones de Pierre por algo más que amistad. Más tarde Son le mostrará las fotos que le prometimos, pero permítame invitarlo a un café y cuénteme quién es usted, por qué está aquí en París. En más de un año, ningún francés me había hecho esta pregunta. Se asumía arrogantemente que la ciudad era uno de los centros del mundo y que mi presencia allí, como la de cualquier otro extranjero, respondía a esto. La cultura francesa nos había atraído y sus poseedores naturales hacían poco por conocer nuestras circunstancias. Comencé dándole a Pétremont unas coordenadas básicas. Le hablé de mis estudios, de mi deseo de escribir, de los intereses que me habían llevado a apasionarme por Plon, pero el calor de su escucha me hizo entrar en detalles personales. Hablé de los tiempos duros, del intento de suicidio de Marie, de la soledad que había vivido en la ciudad y cómo la lectura de Neptune y el mundo al que me había abierto Plon posibilitaron de muchas maneras mi resistencia. Pétremont me escuchaba fumando una de las pipas que tenía puestas en fila sobre su escritorio. sorbiendo el café que Son, su esposa, había traído con una sonrisa y una ligera inclinación de cabeza, antes de sentarse a participar de la conversación y encender también su larga pipa. Cuando hube acabado, Petremont intervino. Veo que a su edad ha vivido mucho y sufrido bastante. No le debe haber sido fácil permanecer en esta ciudad que en tantos aspectos no es acogedora. Es cierto que aquí hay, como en todas partes, gente buena, pero debo añadir que se ocultan bastante. Conocí a un puertorriqueño en Saigón, dijo Son. Peleaba con los americanos. Estaba obligado a hacerlo, dije. Lo sé, por eso la guerra es trágica. No sé si sabe, dijo Petremont, que Pierre no llegó a enseñar en la universidad sino hasta muy poco tiempo antes de morir. Para la academia, las culturas amazónicas eran casi totalmente carentes de interés. No tenían el prestigio de las grandes civilizaciones americanas. Todavía muchos tienen una mirada similar a la de los conquistadores, solo que ahora buscan el oro de los muertos. Los indios que le interesaban a Pierre eran nómadas, no construían nada duradero y andaban desnudos. Lévi-Strauss abrió una senda teórica, pero Pierre hizo brecha con sus escritos, con su retrato complejo y humano de esos seres al borde del exterminio. Nuestra pobreza de espíritu, me refiero al occidental típico, aún al culto, es insondable. Luego de frotar un fósforo y volver a encender la pipa, añadió: en buena medida fui víctima de esos prejuicios. Comencé estudiando chino y sánscrito, las culturas budista y taoísta, y esto es válido. Mucho me ha dejado. Sin embargo, un día conseguí una plaza en la Alianza Francesa y me enviaron a Phnom Penh, en Kampuchea. Con los años viajé por Laos, Tailandia, Birmania y Vietnam. Aparte de las lenguas nacionales, aprendí los idiomas de los pueblos de las montañas y después de dejar la Alianza, pasé largas temporadas con algunos de ellos. No tuve el aplomo de Pierre para constituirme en la voz de su memoria y hacer su herencia. Además, muchos de ellos están vivos, aunque cada día más amargos y desgajados por la modernidad. En fin, en Francia y en otros países de Europa padecemos la pasión anal de la arqueología. Si una cultura trabaja la piedra o los metales, podemos desenterrar sus bíbelos y meterlos en un museo. ¿No se ha percatado de que estas instituciones son gigantescos mausoleos? Allí no se halla nada vivo. La historia de Neptune, a la que usted hacía referencia, es divina, pero trágicamente expresa un deseo irrealizable.
So this next passage is from the end of the novel, when the Puerto Rican writer returns home. His mentors are trying to convince him to stay in Paris and to seek out a career there, but he feels compelled to return to Puerto Rico, and he tries to become a writer, and he teaches in the university, but he feels that he's not acknowledged. His work is not read, and there's a point in which he sort of gives up on writing, and he decides to sort of devote himself fully to the graphic arts, to the visual arts. And this has to do with this moment of renouncing, when he actually sort of decides to quit literature and sort of just engage in the visual arts. Books. For the first time in my life, I stopped reading novels and poetry. I would buy art books from catalogs because they were practically impossible to obtain in Puerto Rico, and would devote my creative efforts to painting and sculpting. I even thought that the well of words had dried up. From time to time, I picked up from my library some book I hadn't read, which was almost always a novel. I would read for about a fourth and always leave them there unfinished, indifferent to their denouement. I often went to bookstores without even pausing in front of the shelves of literature, I didn't keep up with the new writers coming out, and for the first time I had to ask others who was this and that author, and what was important about them. I even reached the point of getting annoyed at the reputation of others, perhaps because I couldn't admit to myself the suspicion that my energy and willpower had been in the long run insufficient. I spent months working with wood, immersed in a rhythm of gouges, mallets, and axes, in which there was no place for words and adjectives. It was liberating. I worked with my hands, with the earthy and tangible. Little by little, I was creating the world I would take to a museum in San Juan. I already had a date for the show and some money donated by a sponsor. I was enthralled with my tools, with their long tradition that enabled me to do without electrical machinery. I cut and polished by hand, awash in the poetry of sweat and muscle. My books remained in the past, buried in the warehouses of their incompetent publishers. I didn't present myself to anyone as a writer. I was annoyed by my wife's habit to announce to people the lost existence of my books. I reached the point of preferring my body to my mind. The scars on my hands were a source of pride, as were the conversations I carried on with carpenters and cabinet makers in the lines buying wood from timber dealers. A few days before the show opened, I was already getting to set it up. I answered the phone. When I was already getting to set it up, I answered the phone. On the other end, I heard a man's voice. Alejandro Espinal had returned. While I listened to him, I realized that it wasn't during vacation time, but rather in the middle of the academic semester. I imagined that he might have finished his studies, but I realized that this was impossible. Since our last meetings, enough time hadn't passed. As on other occasions, his conversation over the phone was coherent and even pleasant. I again had hopes that he might be doing better. In some way, the nature of which I didn't understand, I was drawn to Alejandro's life. Perhaps through him, I was trying to confront my own assumptions or to confront my doubts to see up to what point I was similar or foreign to what he was. I couldn't see him right away, but I invited him to come by the museum the night of the opening. I was taken up with a long list of tasks during these days. The night of the opening arrived, and before anyone could enter, I went around the rooms. There was the alphabet of my vertebrate forms, of my bones of wood. All that remained of my literary past were a few words written in block letters on some of the paintings that hung on the walls. I stood still for a second and breathed with satisfaction. The silence washed over me and vibrated on my skin.
Por esa época me alejé de los libros. Por primera vez en mi vida adulta dejé de leer novelas y poesía. Compraba por catálogo, porque eran casi imposibles de conseguir en el país, libros de arte y dedicaba mi esfuerzo creativo a la plástica. Llegué a pensar que se me había secado la fuente de palabras. De vez en cuando tomaba de mi biblioteca algún volumen que no había leído, que casi siempre eran novelas. Recorría una cuarta parte y las dejaba, indiferente a los desenlaces. Fui en muchas ocasiones a librerías sin ni siquiera detenerme frente a los anaqueles de literatura. No estuve al tanto de la producción de una camada de nuevos escritores y fue la primera vez que tuve que preguntar quién era este o aquel, qué los hacía notorios. Llegué incluso a irritarme ante las reputaciones ajenas debido a la inconfesada sospecha de que mi energía y voluntad habían sido, a la larga, insuficientes. Pasé meses trabajando la madera, sumido en un ritmo de gubias, malletes y hachas, en el que no había lugar para verbos y adjetivos. Era una liberación. Trabajaba con las manos, con lo tangible y terrestre. Iba poco a poco creando el mundo que llevaría a un museo de San Juan. Tenía ya fecha para la exposición y algún dinero donado por un auspiciador. Embelezaba con mis herramientas, con su larga tradición que me hacía prescindir de la maquinaria eléctrica. Cortaba y pulía a mano, inmerso en la poesía del sudor y el músculo. Mis libros quedaban en el pasado, sepultados en los almacenes de sus incompetentes editores. Ante nadie me presentaba como escritor y me irritaba la costumbre de mi esposa de anunciarle a la gente la existencia perdida de mis libros. Llegué a preferir mi cuerpo a mi mente. Me enorgullecían las cicatrices de mis manos y las conversaciones que sostenía con ebanistas y carpinteros en las filas de las madereras. Unos días antes de la apertura de la exposición, cuando ya había comenzado a montarla, contesté el teléfono. En la línea hablaba una voz de hombre. Alejandro Espinal había regresado. Mientras él escuchaba, me di cuenta de que no estábamos en época de vacaciones, sino en pleno semestre académico. Imaginé que habría terminado sus estudios, pero me di cuenta de que era imposible. Desde nuestro último encuentro no había pasado el tiempo suficiente. Como en otras ocasiones, su conversación al teléfono fue coherente e incluso agradable. Me ilusioné de nuevo con la posibilidad de que estuviera mejor. De alguna forma, cuya naturaleza no comprendía, la vida de Alejandro, de alguna forma cuya naturaleza no comprendía, me atraía a la vida de Alejandro. Quizás intentaba por medio de él confirmar mis certezas o enfrentar mis dudas, ver hasta qué punto era su similar o su extraño. No podía verlo de inmediato, pero lo invité a pasar por el museo en la noche de la apertura. Una larga lista de tareas me acaparó durante esos días. Llegó la noche de la inauguración y antes de que nadie entrara, recorrí las salas. Allí estaba el alfabeto de mis formas vertebradas, de mis huesos de palo. Solo quedaban de mi pasado literario unas pocas palabras escritas en letra de molde en algunas de los cuadros que colgaban en las paredes. Me detuve un segundo y respiré satisfecho. El silencio cubría mi piel y vibraba.
For their own and as one offered to their readers. In a world where the textual experience has been besieged by informational formulas, information technology is always formalistic, reductive. Literariness has become progressively unknowable. This condition is precisely that which opens up a unique space of meanings that otherwise would be impossible to reach. The unknowable space of a text is not found by stumbling around blindly, but rather by being blinded. In this altered state of reality, the extremes of light and shadow coexist, each one infiltrating the other. Perception ceases to be exclusively optical and becomes also present in silences that are filled of meaning, that are as filled of meaning as the words themselves. Even in the information age, the writer is irreducible. Their texts are performance in the real time of the book as it is being read. The literary text cannot be reduced to encyclopedic or archivistic knowledge, not even to the memory of its own reading. The writer cannot help but not be present in their time. Herein lies their authority, which is indisputable, because by not existing, their territory, which is a world alternate to what was believed up until that point, is impossible. The literary word does not fit inside the world from which it originates. Most of their contemporaries are blind to it. This is not the fault of the time, rather the contrary, the necessary conditions for its production and circulation. Without the invisibilization that precedes it, the power of what is written would be impossible. One cannot agree with a writer. This is not their function. In any case, agreeing would be a misunderstanding of what is being communicated. A true writer is simultaneously a discovery and a disagreement. Someone who is not in the plans, something not yet included in any manual.
El escritor, al menos cierto tipo de escritor, es un atleta del fracaso. Las esperanzas y los sueños le duran poco y dejan marcas. El acto de escribir es para él una técnica de supervivencia y un consuelo, de tanto personal como ofrendado a los lectores. En un mundo en que la experiencia textual ha sido asediada por las fórmulas de la información, la informática es siempre formulista, reductora. Lo literario resulta progresivamente incognoscible. Esta condición es la que precisamente abre el espacio único de significados al que de cualquier otro modo sería imposible de arribar. La zona incognoscible del texto no se da por la ceguera, sino por el deslumbramiento. En este estado alterado de la realidad es que los extremos de la luz y la sombra coexisten y se penetran mutuamente. La percepción deja de ser exclusivamente óptica y se encuentra también en los silencios, tan llenos de sentido como las palabras mismas. Aún en la era de la información, el escritor es irresumible. Sus textos son una performance en el tiempo real de la lectura de un libro. El texto literario no es reducible a un saber enciclopédico o archivista, ni siquiera a un recuerdo de lectura. El escritor no puede sino no estar en el tiempo. Aquí reside su vigencia, que es incuestionable, porque de no existir es imposible su territorio, que es un mundo alterno a lo que hasta ese momento se creía. La palabra literaria no cabe en el mundo en que se origina. La mayor parte de sus contemporáneos son ciegos ante ella. Esto no es una carencia de época, sino lo contrario, las condiciones imprescindibles para su producción y circulación. Sin una invisibilización que la anteceda, resulta imposible la potencia de lo escrito. No se puede estar de acuerdo con un escritor. Esta no es su función. En todo caso, el acuerdo sería un malentendido de lo informativo. Un escritor verdadero es simultáneamente un descubrimiento y un desencuentro. Alguien que no estaba en los planes, algo que en ningún manual se había formulado.
That was the outcome of our experiment. We had some questions to start a conversation, but I think that at this point, what we would like is to people in the audience to perhaps respond to the readings, the selections, and the translations, or the translations and the readings.